Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our guest today is Mark Roseman, the author of A Past in Hiding, Memory and Survival in Nazi Germany. It's quite an interesting book. Of recent, there seems to be a wave of books about the Holocaust and its survivors, but yours, A Past in Hiding, Memory and Survival in Nazi Germany, has a decidedly distinctive twist. The survivor was in plain view, a version of what I would think is a very mobile Anne Frank, if you will. How did you get involved in this story, and how did you uncover the material you used for your research?
Originally by chance. A German museum where I had contacts had come across a brief article which Marianne Ellenbogen had written in the 1980s. And in fact, it's the only thing that she ever wrote about her years underground, and it's a very obscure little journal. And they asked me if I would do an interview with her for an exhibition that the museum was doing about life during the war. And that was our first meeting. I was very struck by her, found her very interesting, and things that she told me even then were extraordinary. But she indicated to me that it wasn't going to go any further. And it was only in the last months of her life, when she was already very poorly and knew she didn't have that long to live, that she re-established the contact. And it was through our conversations then that the story began. But a lot of the material I only found later. Some of it was hidden away in her house, and also the German records turned out to be strikingly comprehensive for her family. So I was able to track down sources, and then through the sources reach other witnesses who are spread across the world, in the United States, in Argentina, all across Europe, and in Israel. So it became quite a story.
Well, and we must emphasize, this is not some fictionalized biography. This is a very carefully constructed historical work using a great deal of research and about a specific person, historical person. And of course, the part of that question I'd asked earlier is, why another book about a Holocaust survivor?
Yeah, that's right. I think obviously there have already been a lot of accounts of survivors, and so I think that if you're going to publish another one, then you really have to be sure that you have something distinctive to say. And I think that with Marianne's story, I had three distinctive things that I wanted to get across. First of all, as you've already indicated, this was a very distinctive survival trajectory. She survived the war living inside Nazi Germany on the run. So she wasn't, strictly speaking, in hiding. She was passing as an Aryan. And that seemed to me open up a different kind of survival, different kinds of possibilities to the accounts that we know of to now. That was one thing that was distinctive. Secondly, the really quite unbelievable range of sources that emerged meant that alongside the story of her survival, there was also a detective story about uncovering a past that had been in hiding for more than 50 years. And the third thing that I think is, or I hope is distinctive about this biography, is that because of these materials, it allowed a juxtaposition between her own memory and what other sources suggested that enabled me to say some things about memory itself and about how a narrative of survival gets constructed, which again, where often we simply have to rely on the memories of the survivor. That's not possible. And so those three things together, I think, make it to really a distinctive survivor story.
Well, we've done an interview with someone else who had also done a work in terms of with Holocaust survivors, and there are some of these people now are starting to die off, and so there is a real worry that if there aren't these narratives and constructions, that we might lose a valuable insight into one of the most horrific events of this century, or past century now, but I mean during the 20th century.
That's right, but of course there are now these huge data banks of testimony. There are thousands of published accounts, but then there are tens of thousands more unpublished accounts, some of them recorded immediately after the war, some of them recorded in the 50s, 60s, and a lot recorded over the last 10, 15 years as consciousness has grown, that if you don't do this now, we won't have a chance to speak to survivors.
As I read the book, I kept having these questions in my mind. You know, how did she survive? You know, full view in Nazi Germany. You know, it took great pride on precise records and documentation, and insisting this on sometimes spur of the moment situations. And maybe we go through some of those elements of how that happened.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, her survival, actual survival story really has two parts to it. The first part, from 1941 to 1943, is the story of how not only herself but her family were given special protection by the Wehrmacht, the German army's intelligence section, the Abwehr. And this is a very little known story. It is known that there were groups within the Abwehr who were actually anti-Nazi and were secretly working. Eventually they were part of the military resistance involved in the 1944 bomb plot, and many of them were murdered by the Nazis in the aftermath of that. But what's less known is that these resistance groups were also trying, although I mean I must say, given that they're very top of the intelligence organization, what they managed to achieve is fairly limited, but still they are trying to protect some Jews, and that's not so well known. And Marianne's father was very lucky in the sense that his connections via his banker enabled him to gain contact to the Abwehr. And on the point at which the family were going to be deported in October 1941, in one of the first big deportations of German Jews to the Lodz ghetto, just at the last minute, the Abwehr protection kicked in, and the Gestapo sent them home. Now, the ostensible reason that the Abwehr uses to protect some Jews is it says it's going to use them to spy for Germany abroad. And indeed, a number of German and also Dutch Jews did manage to get to safety abroad with Abwehr backing under the pretext that they were going to spy for the Reich. I mean, of course, they weren't going to, but this was the story that was used. But even with the Abwehr's help, it wasn't easy to get abroad. You still needed permits, and the Gestapo and other organizations do the best that they can to frustrate that. And in the case of the Strauss family, Marianne's family, there was her father and her mother, her brother, herself, and then also her father's twin brother and his family. They simply weren't able to surmount these various efforts made to frustrate their departure. And what's really astonishing is that the Gestapo records on the family are complete, and therefore we can follow this process of conflict between the Abwehr and the Gestapo step by step by step by miserable step. Marianne also keeps a diary in this time, and so we know about her thoughts. And unrelated to survival, but you know, another remarkable part of the book is the relationship that she develops with another German Jew, Ernst Krombach, who is deported this time, and they maintain a really quite remarkable, indeed in some senses really unique correspondence between the Polish ghetto to which he was deported until his murder. So that's the first phase, and that extends until 1943. And in a way, there's such a small group of people who are lucky enough to come under the Abwehr's protection that one could hardly ascribe their survival to any particular quality, except to say that her father and her uncle's military record in the First World War, and the fact that they're very well connected and still have quite considerable resources in blocked bank accounts, means that they're able to offer the banker some quite considerable resources, their house, and they also have a plausible record for the Abwehr to use them as spies. They needed to have people with military background who looked like they could plausibly work for the Abwehr. In the summer of 1943, the Abwehr basically collapses as an independent organization, folds in the face of the increasing pressure from Himmler's SS and his own security organization, the SD. and they have to agree to drop their Jewish agents, and a telegram comes into Dusseldorf to say that they now have no longer need for the Strauss family, and that really is the end for Marianne's family. But during this year, Marianne had got to know a group that until now had been really completely unknown to historians, a group called the League for Socialist Life, the Bund Gemeinschaft für Sozialistisches Leben, and they were based in Essen, but had members all the way around the Ruhr and in some other German towns. And their leader had offered to Marianne that if it ever came to it and she needed help, they would try and help her. They may also have offered to help her brother, I don't know, but she was the one who had contact with them. And so when suddenly, without the family expecting it, the Gestapo turn up to deport them to Theresienstadt and give them just 2 hours to get ready, in an unwatched moment, Marianne slips out of the house and runs. Her family knew that she was going, and in fact her father gave her some money that he was keeping in the house. And so now we're in a completely different phase. Now her survival depends on this group of idealistic, left-wing, closely linked people who are influenced partly by socialist ideas, partly by Kant. Their distinctive thing was they try and fuse Kant's philosophy of the ethical imperatives and the individual with Marx's idea of social change. And for the next 2 years, Marianne survives, and this is what you alluded to at the beginning, passing as a German, spending a week or two, because you couldn't really stay any longer than that with any one family before it became too noticeable to neighbours and family, and then moving on to the next. And really her life in this period is quite remarkable because she doesn't really have proper ID. She only has a sort of a postal certificate which would get her so far but doesn't really constitute proper ID. She is moving around on trains and trams. There are permanent controls. And so now how does she survive in that period, and why is it that this group was able to do this? And she wasn't the only Jew that they protected either. I mean, whatever resources she had, Marianne herself, there's no doubt that without this group she'd have been sunk. You know, she wouldn't have even tried to run out the house, because where would she go? So her survival depended on a very unusual network. The Bund had a lot of things in its favour, but I think one of the most important things was that, on the one hand, it's not a formal organisation. It never had a statute. It never had formal membership. It didn't immediately have those things that made it very easy for the Gestapo to identify, trace and wind up, unlike a lot of the political organisations, which were very easily wound up by the Gestapo in the first couple of years. On the other hand, they had sworn this oath, like they call it a Verpflichtung or commitment, and so they're informal, but they have this very strong oath of loyalty. There are no loose members. There's nobody lightly affiliated. There's a small group, at this time probably a couple of hundred members at most, maybe less, of people who are very tightly linked to this group and very strongly committed to opposing the Nazi regime. And there had been Jewish members. In fact, there were one full member was already in hiding when Marianne went in hiding, and the wife of the founder of the group was also Jewish, protected because she was married to a non-Jew. At this stage, those in mixed marriages were not being targeted. So that had, heightened the group's awareness from an early stage of what was happening to Jewish people. That also makes them aware. So this is the very unusual environment that Marianne runs into, and she was so very lucky in doing so. On the other hand, I think many other people wouldn't have been able to survive. She'd obviously benefited from the fact that her parents' connections and the Abwehr had meant that she doesn't need to go into hiding until the end of 43, and that makes a difference because by then almost everyone in Germany knew the war was lost. So the outlook, it wasn't going to go on forever. You could keep something in hiding. It wasn't going to go on forever. And then her own abilities. She is astonishingly calm. I mean, she manages to pass so well because she actually, in her inner identity, becomes one of them. And we know this because of her diary. You know, she writes in the diary, and it's fascinating what she writes. She doesn't see herself as a Jewish girl pursued by the Nazis. Though of course she'll have known that's what she was. She sees herself as one of a group of upright citizens trying to find ways of behaving and an ethics that will enable them not only to survive, but to create a better society after the war. And so, of course, that identity, the left-wing identity, couldn't come out into the open, but it was much closer to the identity she was passing as than the Jewish one. And I think the degree to which she became one of them, the fact that they gave her not only a place to hide, but also a person to be, was really crucial in her ability to survive.
Well, one of the things that fascinated me in that first phase was how her family negotiated with the Nazi regime over different issues and talking about fines or extension.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, you raised a number of points. I agree with all of them. She would say bloody mindedness, by the way, in terms of the quality that she'd had since a small child. And that's certainly, yes, from the very first memories right through to the end of her life, there's an indomitable character there. You know, she didn't suffer fools gladly. She didn't let herself be pushed around. I mean, that's, you know, that's there right from the beginning. It's a trait that runs right through. And you're right. The family saw themselves as an elite within the Jewish community. They saw themselves as part of established German society. I mean, of course, that was the reason why they'd never left Germany in time. But there was a confidence, and clearly when they were dealing with German authorities, you know, at least up to 1941, there were remnants of some willingness on the part of the authorities to recognize the German in them that responds to this confidence on their part, and means that until 1941 there are still faint echoes of the propriety that they had expected from the German officialdom until 1933. Yes, I was. You were talking about the negotiations over how much they should pay for this Jewish tax that was raised on all Jewish property after Kristallnacht, and I was surprised. I mean, I think part of it is that they can't give up the faith that somewhere they will get just treatment from the German authorities, because if they give that up, they're finished. So in some way there's almost an act of desperation in continuing to believe that if you write the right letter with the right tone, you'll get the right response from German officialdom. I think, you know, that was almost on their part a survival strategy. But as you say, I mean, it is surprising that on a number of occasions it works within a totally unjust tax and a totally unjust overall laws. They're managing to get small glimpses of equity or fairness or a certain amount of allowance for this or that factor. And I think that maybe you're suggesting, and it's not something I develop in the book, but I would absolutely agree with it, that in a way Marianne is her father's daughter in that she takes on this confidence. You know, although she would not identify with their particular German Jewish identity, that's not her generation's. It wasn't open to them. Still, there's a kind of a confidence of your right to be in this society. Maybe even your right to be a leader in this society, which she absorbs and carries on, although in a different form.
Well, in some books that I've read about prisoners of war and other people in desperate situations, sometimes taking that stance of assertiveness can help if it's carefully done. I mean, there's stories, of course, about the British officers who were prisoners of war and their ability to construct some kind of order within whatever shambles they were in did help. So I kept trying to envision that. And the other thing that I was struggling with to a certain extent, I mean, what opened up, it wasn't from your book, was that I often think that the economics of the fascist regime in Nazi Germany has not still been fully explored, and its role in influencing the enforcement of policies. And they really, as the war went on, were in worse and worse shape in wanting to negotiate with people who might have money or influence on their behalf. So I wondered if in a way the family and then Marianne weren't tapping into that sort of in some way, that they were playing into that. Certainly not when she was in phase 2, but along the way. I don't know, but there was this thing. I was wondering, well, if they really needed people, and the money. Well, how that was a factor in it. But still, this specific construction, and that's what's the marvelous thing you point out, of her constructing her identity as she was on the run, and I mean, it's just an extraordinary tale.
I must say that I think the economics issue is difficult. Certainly in the 1930s, there are economic motives for trying to expropriate Jews, both from the state's point of view and from the level of the sort of individuals roundabout who stand to benefit. And, there's a classic example of the person who writes in who wants to take over their flats and can't see why. This is somebody who wants a flat for himself, and why should Jews have a flat when he could have it as a non-Jew? But increasingly, it seems to me, as that the whole persecution story is so economically senseless. It's true that there is some kind of planning in the East in which one could say that reducing population densities had a certain logic, but really the way in which Jews were sorted, the commitment to maintaining transport to the concentration camps when transport and manpower, the lack of consideration for manpower issues, in the whole of Eastern Europe. So I think the economics of persecution of Jews is extremely peculiar.
I would certainly grant you that it was eccentric at best. One of the things that is fascinating is your research and the extent of it and all the different ways and things you looked at. And we talked just before this interview about, the confronting the reader with all these methods. I happen to enjoy that. That made all the difference between just another biography or another kind of exploration. You really looked at photographs, diaries, documents, letters, reports, Gestapo reports. You did interviews on 3 continents, and then you had your own conversations with her. Although perhaps we ought to talk about that first. That was what triggered your interest, but then really came late, and then you had to do the research.
That's right. It began with conversations with her, and of course nobody knew exactly how long she was going to live. In fact, as it turned out, her son had heard that she might only have weeks to live. So I knew that I was operating under time pressure, but still, when she died at the end of the year, I felt I'd lost a friend, but also just in terms of making sure that I knew everything that she had to tell me, it became very unexpectedly, and I wasn't sure at that stage whether really there was enough material to do more than just write a short pamphlet or something about her life. But I was already committed to going to Germany to do my first research trip, and that already uncovered some amazing materials above all these Gestapo materials, which made it that actually they're one of the probably the best documented case where the Abwehr was involved. I don't think there's anything other case like it. But while I was there, her son was having to begin winding up her house, and then started coming across this unbelievable material that she had in the house, which was just kept on coming for more than a year. We would just be finding more and more things because it was all squirreled away in nooks and crannies and in plastic bags and envelopes and jiffy bags, and she's normally very orderly, but she obviously just couldn't confront this. So that was an extraordinary story in itself. So that made me realize that part of what was going on here was a detective story, and then as finding letters of her enabled me to seek out addresses, and I got hold of her former fiancé's brother in Argentina, and relatives in Sweden who'd received postcards from the family in Theresienstadt, and distant cousins in Israel, and links in Australia. I realized that this was something, an unraveling of a hidden past which it deserved itself. So that's one of the reasons for looking at the documentation was simply just to get that detective story across. But it wasn't just that. You mentioned at the beginning that this is not a fictional account, and for me, because there are some accounts which blur the border, they're sort of half fictional. They blur the boundary between fact and fiction. And I feel with the Holocaust this is dangerous. I feel that it's something where we need to be absolutely sure what we know. And I wanted to make clear also the limits of what you can know. I mean, I think I said at one time that in some ways the Nazi era is a bit of a black hole, because either people are remembering from such different circumstances. If they are survivors, they're remembering across the bridge of their trauma. If they're perpetrators, they're remembering with all those pressures to not be open about their account. Yeah. But if they're documents, we don't know under what circumstances of censorship or regime pressures or responding to some kind of official initiative the documents themselves were constructed. They may be unchanged, but we're not quite sure how reliable they were to begin with. So every source requires its own interrogation, if you like to use a Gestapo term. So I wanted to make that process transparent. And I guess also, there was also a sort of influenced by postmodernism and interest in deconstructing narratives a little bit. And in one case, there's 3 or 4 different trajectories or ways of seeing coexisting with each other. So there was that kind of playfulness that I wanted to get in. But really the issue was uncovering the difficulty of knowing.
Where there's sort of just an enumeration going on. Well, you've got a story to tell, okay, say it. And then next, then say that. And that's not valuable or as valuable as what you've done, which is to then go back and try to reconstruct as best you can based on the research.
And also, I mean, I think one has to be realistic. There's only so many accounts that people can absorb and meaningfully deal with. I mean, I think there comes a point where you just don't want to read another one. So I think if you are going to tell a life, then you have to do it in a way that has something distinct, or tries to have something distinctive to say.
Well, I found this story quite interesting because I said she was Anne Frank in the German society. And if you read this thing, how could that be? We've heard all these stories that the Germans are very proficient and they, ID cards and all the Stars of David and everything. But here was someone who was able to actually circulate for a long period of time. Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yes.